Hi, I'm Judy Kane. I teach philosophy, and I don't know which of you my question is more directed towards. I think Mario, perhaps, but given the nature of what's happening, what is there that we can do?
This fight with the Westlands Water District is still going on, especially this reclamation stuff. The law did change in 1982 to allow the maximum acreage limit to be 960. And that happened under Reagan because there's actually the National Endowment people actually get this to the Supreme Court, right? They lose, but the laws ultimately changed anyway, right? Right now, the Westlands Water District still has this Kesterson Reservoir problem. Their water's not draining. They still have a massive cleanup that needs to be taken care of. Literally within the last 3 weeks, Congress, the president, the Westlands Water District, has hammered out a deal in secret to not only relieve the Westlands Water District of the responsibility of cleaning it and forcing the federal government to clean it, and also not paying back the recordable contracts, which is a whole other issue I didn't even talk about. They also are trying to lift all acreage limitations on the land. So literally today, you can call your congressman, you can call your senators, and tell them not to sign. It's passed the House. It's in the Senate now, and is awaiting, a vote. You can literally call them and tell them to reject the Westlands Water District deal. If you just Google it right now, there's going to be tons of stories in the news. And I think that's really sort of part of the beginning here is we need to be able to enforce the existing law, right, that exists. And then hopefully as we build sort of momentum, we can reverse the Reclamation Reform Act of '82. I think those are sort of really big strides here at this point, really big battles that are happening kind of under the radar. I mean, they're not on the national news, they're not on anything, but the LA Times is covering it fairly well. Fresno Bee obviously has a lot invested in it, so they cover it fairly well. But there's tons of opposition to this as well that I don't think existed in the 80s, largely because of the drought conditions that we live in now, right? Water's on everybody's mind now. And it wasn't, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to the extent that it is now. I should mention also that what's happening currently in the Westlands Water District, this is a separate story, but related. So the Westlands Water District just buys acre feet, right? And so an acre foot of water is about 360,000 gallons. And they get 360,000 gallons for about $20 an acre foot, okay? And then they sell it, right? So they've retired some of the land of the 600,000 acres. They've retired about 200,000 acres, but they still get their allotment of water every year. And what they've done now is that they sold it to other water districts around them at really ridiculous prices. And they sell it back to the county of Fresno, who then turns around and sells it to unincorporated communities, which are mostly farm worker communities. And so again, they're getting 350,000 gallons of water for $20, and then they charge farm workers $100 a month for water. And water that's contaminated, or they can't take showers in, they can't, at this point, the state water project has issued a state of emergency where they're shipping in bottled water to these farm working communities because they can't drink it and they can't shower in it and they can't wash in it. And so this is a huge thing that's still very much a fight over water in the Westlands Water District. And there's definitely lots of things we can do about it, right? There's definitely organizing around it. And some of these farm workers, part of what I'm trying to do is tell the story that these farm workers have lived in these communities for 40 years, and it happens to them every year. And only now it's really starting to get a lot of traction, again, because of California's drought. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
I'm Bill Anelli, and I teach philosophy here. So I have a couple questions. Can answer any of these. One is mechanization. Robotization is coming down in price significantly in the past few years. So how will that affect future labor on farms? And I guess that'd be like row crops versus fruit trees and that kind of thing.
The question of mechanization is something that I'm sort of always thinking about, and it's been kind of a boogeyman of farm work for a long time, and I'm not really sure where it's going. The big example is the tomato harvester, right, that UC Davis creates. And what's interesting with the story that gets lost, right, is that they're always sort of telling about this huge output that they're able to use with the tomato harvester. But the tomato harvester doesn't replace a market, it actually creates one, right? And so fresh tomatoes are still picked by hand, right? Most of these things are still being done by, it doesn't really displace farm workers on the level that people would assume that it would, because the farm workers are still picking fresh tomatoes. It just created industry of canned tomatoes, right? I mean, before the tomato harvester, there really wasn't a large industry in canned tomatoes because, you know, like the tomato harvester can't pick them the way that you can with a fresh, with a real hand, right? And so I'm always kind of struggling with, like, you know, for 40 years, right? I mean, Caesar's writing about this in his journals, and Pete Velasco, who was the vice president of the UFW, is like doing massive amounts of research on mechanization and what's going to happen to the farm worker. And Caesar himself predicts the end of the farm worker, right? This is one of the reasons that he moves the union from 40 acres out to La Paz and starts this kind of intentional community, because he's like, farm workers are going away, right? Everything's going to be mechanized. The whole fields will be mechanized. And it just hasn't happened, right? It just hasn't happened. Like, there's a new thing that I saw from UC Davis that was like the drones, right? The drones now, and like the, you know, and yeah, harvesting drones, and like the laser guided lettuce pickers, and like all this stuff. And you're just like, I'm like, okay, I'll believe it when I see it, right? I mean, and even when we do see it, it's going to be I think it's just going to create other markets. Like, I don't know that farm workers are ever going to be replaced by machines.
I want to ask about fracking and the possible competition between the oil companies and the farming corporations. Is that a factor here in terms of also polluting the water?
The one thing I can tell you that's happening, and again, I might get them going down this path, but what I'm finding right now is that the Westlands Water District has become so salinated, right, that they have to retire lands. And so what the big thing in the Westlands now is solar farms. So there's solar farms all over the Westlands Water District, because they can't do anything else, right? You can't grow anything on some of this land. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that ultimately the people that own a huge portion of this land are energy companies, are Chevron or Shell or Standard. So I think, or Shell and Standard is the same thing, I think. But yeah, I don't think that's a coincidence. That, you know, they're in the business. They're in business, right? So I haven't heard anything about fracking, and at least in the Westlands, and I don't know that much about it. But there's definitely ways of trying to capitalize the land past agriculture. Right? They can't do anything with agriculture anymore.
Lisa Riggs and I teach here in nursing. This has been very interesting. I come from a long line of farming families, over 50 years. And you don't have to look any further than the foothills right in our area between going up above Oakdale to see the thousands of acres of almonds that have been planted that are corporation. Mm-hmm. What is your definition of small farmer? Because is that what you said? There was about 5% were small farmers?
Yeah.
What acreage is small farming?
Again, so the definition that I'm trying to use here is about labor, right? It's not about acreage. If you can, you know, like I said, you can do 1,000 acres with a family of cotton, you know, or of alfalfa, or, you know, hay or grass. What I'm really interested in is who's doing the work, mm-hmm. right? If you have a team of 1,000 seasonal laborers, you're not a family farm anymore, right? You're not a small farm. You're a corporation, right? You have employees. You have you know, that's to me what's important. I'm not that concerned about sort of annual receipts or acreage, mm-hmm. even. To me, what's important is what's, you know, we have this like you said, this Jeffersonian idea of the family farm and all the good things that come with that, and it's totally being misused. I mean, it's being completely misused. You know, residency to me is a big part of it as well. I actually didn't mention that. Like, mm-hmm. In the '82 the Reclamation Reform Act, the residency requirement was taken out, and so I'd like to do some sort of work here in the Central Valley to think about who lives on the land. Right? Iowa has this great farm census that they do every year, or every 5 years, and one of the things that they found was that the average owner of the farmland in Iowa lives like 6 hours away, right? In Chicago mostly, right? And so that's the kind of things that I wanted to sort of highlight, and what's important about the distinction between corporate farms and, family farms or small farms is who lives there and who does the work.
Hi there, I'm Tamara McNeil. I live in the East Bay. I live in Berkeley, and I run a supper club called the Bay Area Gastronomers. And so one of the reasons why I started the group was because I found that I love to eat out, but I hated eating alone. And so I wanted to eat with other people so that I could try more dishes. And the group started really small, and now we have like almost 1,300 people in the group. And so what that tells me is that people also want to connect not only with the food that they're eating, but with one another. And so what I've been thinking about for quite a long time now is how do we bridge the gap between people who are enjoying really good, innovative food that is grown in the Central Valley. There is zero connection between that food. And so what suggestions do you guys have for making this growing population, because there's been such a huge influx of workers in San Francisco who have high discretionary incomes due to tech? So these are the people who are at the restaurant openings. These are the people who are, spending $100 on meals that, didn't exist a couple years ago. And so that's the kind of group that I'm catering to with my supper club. And I would really like to just find a way to help people connect with this process of where our food comes from, who's growing it, how much actually it costs to produce this food, so that when they're, forking in truffled mashed potatoes or, a spinach salad with, balsamic reduction strawberries, like, what is the difference between how much it costs to make that meal and how much the restaurant is charging? So I really would like to sort of, I guess, politicize my group in some way, and I just haven't figured out a way to do it. So wondered if you had, and this is a question for all of you, actually, I would like to hear some sort of concrete suggestions for bridging that gap.
Well, that's like the $1 million question, right? Yeah, I'm trying to make my own intervention here, right? And it's not just your supper club friends; it's the academics in food studies as well, right? There's, like you said, the Michael Pollins of the world and all this, and and there's been this kind of conversation around local and organic and CSAs and this, and I always felt like labor was left out of that. That's all it is. Right. And so I don't know how to bridge, I don't know how to do that, right? I'm writing this book in the hopes of sort of pointing out that this revolution is not really a revolution. Like I said, it's still corporate farms from the 1970s that dominate the food production and supply today, right? Smaller farmers are finding, I think, maybe better outlets for some of their food and the rise of this kind of restaurant industry. But the number in 1981 was 4,893 corporate farms, and in 2007 it was 5,107. It actually grew, right? And so I want to question the narrative that exists around Chez Panisse and the kind of food movement. George Ballas and the National Land for People have their own thing happening concurrently, that it's not influenced by Chez Panisse, and their struggle is rooted in the land, right? And so I really feel like hopefully by telling this story, then we can sort of, dislodge some of the narratives that have developed over the last 20 years about food and food studies. And I think there's activists, especially in Fresno, that are doing this work that can speak to it a lot better than I can. And I think that there's ways to make this happen. If you look at the Fresno Food Commons, they have some really interesting ideas and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. A guy named Dan O'Connell is opened up a storefront on Belmont in Fresno, which is one of the rougher neighborhoods in Fresno, and I think he employs only people from the neighborhood, and he only buys produce from small growers in South County. So maybe that's the way to do that. There's another woman named Janaki that's doing doing those kind of farm to table type meals, but introducing farmers and their stories. And so instead of just coming to eat and, oh, this comes from so-and-so farm, it'll be so-and-so person standing right there telling you, I came from Oaxaca, when I was 12 years old, and da-da-da. And so it kind of forces you to confront, right, like the reality of the people who are producing this food. And so maybe that'll work. I don't know, right? That's what's happening right now in Fresno, what I'm familiar with. And I think there's probably activists in a lot of different places that are also tired of this kind of romanticized narrative around food.